My name is Delaney Marchetti. I'm 31 years old, and I work as a senior claims analyst for a regional health insurance provider in Providence, Rhode Island, which means I've spent the last 7 years learning exactly how medical billing actually works, down to the smallest line item. In front of her entire extended family, my own mother-in-law once told me I would never truly belong in this family, no matter how hard I tried. I sat through the rest of that Easter dinner in a borrowed folding chair at the far end of the table, said nothing, and finished my meal at a normal pace. For months later, her cardiologist looked up from a chart in a crowded waiting room, looked directly at me, and said, "Wait, you're Delaney? The one who's been covering her supplemental costs." If you're watching this, drop a comment telling me where you're from and what time it is right now on your end, and go ahead and hit subscribe, because you genuinely need to see how the rest of this unfolds. Let me take you back to where this whole story actually starts. My husband, Anthony Marchetti, comes from a large, tightly knit Italian-American family in Providence, the kind of family where holidays mean 30 relatives crowded into one house, and everyone has an opinion about everyone else's life choices. Freely offered, rarely requested. My mother-in-law, Rosa, made her disapproval of me obvious from the very first dinner I ever attended with Anthony, 6 years ago. I wasn't Italian, I wasn't Catholic, and I'd grown up, in her exact words, somewhere without any real family structure, a pointed reference to the fact that I was raised primarily by my grandmother after my own parents' struggles with addiction left them unable to raise me with any real consistency. Rosa never said that last part cruelly, exactly. She said it the way you'd mention a stain on a tablecloth, matter of fact, and clearly not going anywhere. The real turning point came 2 years ago. Rosa had recently been diagnosed with a cardiac condition that required expensive supplemental treatment, the kind her Medicare plan only partially covered. She asked Anthony's older brother, Vincent, to help cover the difference. Vincent, quietly dealing with his own financial pressures at the time, declined, but never actually told Rosa directly that he'd said no. For months, Rosa simply assumed the ongoing costs were being absorbed somewhere within the family's collective resources. The way these things sometimes just get handled without anyone spelling it out. In reality, I was the one quietly covering the monthly supplemental billing gap myself, $340 a month, paid directly through the cardiology office. I specifically asked the billing department not to disclose where the payments were coming from, because I didn't want it to become a source of forced gratitude, or worse, family tension. I made that choice for one simple reason. Anthony had confided in me privately late one night, sitting on the edge of our bed with his elbows on his knees, how genuinely scared he was about his mother's health, a fear he'd never once shown in front of his own family, who all seemed to treat Rosa's diagnosis with a kind of forced, determined optimism that left no room for anyone to actually admit they were frightened. I loved him enough to quietly remove one source of that fear without ever needing credit for having done it, and honestly, some part of me also understood. Even then, that showing up for Rosa in a way she'd never noticed was its own kind of answer to the things she'd already started saying about me. The rupture, or at least what I understood as the rupture at the time, came at Easter dinner 2 years into that quiet arrangement. Rosa, in a moment of unguarded frustration during a completely unrelated disagreement over Easter menu planning, something about whether the ham should be glazed or not, of all things, turned to me in front of 15 relatives and said, "Delaney, I know you try, but you'll never truly belong in this family, no matter how hard you work at it. Blood is blood." The table went quiet in that particular way rooms go quiet when everyone heard something they wished they hadn't. I didn't cry, and I remember being almost proud of that fact even in the moment. I set my fork down with what I hope looked like ordinary calm, finished my meal at a completely normal pace, and only excused myself once dessert had properly wrapped up, refusing to give anyone in that room the satisfaction of watching me leave in visible distress. Anthony, sitting beside me, went pale and quiet, visibly torn between his mother and his wife in a way that told me this particular conversation would need to happen later, privately, far away from an audience of 30 relatives. In the days right after that dinner, my sister-in-law, Gianna, pulled me aside in the kitchen while everyone else was still finishing dessert in the other room. "She doesn't mean it the way it sounded," Gianna said, clearly trying to smooth things over the way she always did. "That's just how Ma talks when she's stressed," I told Gianna as gently as I could manage, that I appreciated her trying to help, but that I didn't need the comment translated or softened. I'd heard exactly what Rosa meant. Gianna didn't say much after that, just squeezed my arm before we both rejoined the rest of the family. And I remember thinking that even the people who meant well in that house had spent years learning how to explain Rosa's edges away, rather than actually addressing them. For the months that followed, I kept quietly covering Rosa's supplemental medical costs, not out of some saintly need to prove her wrong, and not because I was holding out for some future moment of vindication. I kept paying simply because stopping would have meant risking an elderly woman's actual cardiac care, and I wasn't willing to let my own hurt feelings become a lever against her health. Anthony and I did eventually have the harder conversation, privately, about what his mother had said at that dinner table. He apologized, genuinely and without excuses, admitting he'd let his mother's comments about me go unchallenged for years out of a desire to keep the family peace intact, even at my expense. I want to be honest with you that those months weren't simply noble suffering on my part, some quiet martyrdom I wore comfortably. There were evenings I genuinely resented the whole arrangement, resented that I was funding the comfort of a woman who just told me, in front of 15 relatives, that I'd never belong. I talked through a lot of that resentment during my weekly phone calls with my own grandmother, the woman who'd actually raised me. She told me something I've carried with me ever since. You're not paying for her bills to earn her love, Delaney. You're paying for them because Anthony loves her and you love Anthony. Keep those two reasons separate in your head, or the resentment will eat you alive. It was good advice, and honestly, it's the only reason I managed to keep the arrangement going without it curdling into something bitter and unrecognizable. There was one evening, maybe 8 months into that stretch, when I nearly stopped the payments altogether. Rosa had made another offhand comment at a smaller family dinner, something about how real family shows up without being asked twice, clearly not realizing, or perhaps not caring. How that comment landed on me specifically, given everything I was quietly doing behind the scenes at that exact moment. I sat in my car afterward in her driveway for almost 20 minutes before I could bring myself to drive home, genuinely questioning why I was still doing this, turning the account information up on my phone screen and staring at it like it might explain itself to me. I called my grandmother from that driveway, the phone cold against my ear in the November air. She reminded me, gently but firmly, that the payments were never really about Rosa's opinion of me in the first place, and that changing my behavior based on her comments would only prove, to myself if no one else, that her opinion had more power over me than it actually deserved. I drove home that night and didn't cancel a single payment, and if I'm honest, that particular phone call in that particular driveway did more to settle my resolve than almost anything else across those 2 years. The moment that changed everything happened by pure coincidence, for months after that Easter dinner. Rosa had a follow-up cardiology appointment, and Anthony, tied up with a deadline at work, asked if I could drive her, an arrangement Rosa accepted with visible, if entirely polite, reluctance, the kind of tight smile she reserved specifically for me. In the waiting room, the billing coordinator, recognizing me instantly from months of processing my monthly payments, greeted me warmly by name, right in front of Rosa. Delaney, good to see you again. We really appreciate how consistent you've been with the account. Rosa turned toward me, confused. What account? The coordinator, realizing a beat too late that this particular piece of information had never actually been shared within the family, glanced at me apologetically before continuing anyway, gently. Your supplemental billing gap, Mrs. Marchetti. Delaney's been covering it directly for a little over 2 years now. At that exact moment, Rosa's cardiologist, Dr. Patricia Ewan, stepped out into the waiting area to call Rosa back for her appointment, catching the tail end of the conversation as she walked up. She looked at me, genuine recognition crossing her face in real time. Wait, you're Delaney? I've seen that name on the account for 2 years straight. I actually mentioned to Mrs. Marchetti once, in passing, that whoever was managing this billing was unusually diligent about it, never missed a payment. I had no idea it was her own daughter-in-law standing right here in front of me. Dr. Ewan, still holding Rosa's chart against her chest, glanced between the two of us, clearly sensing she'd walked into something far more complicated than a routine check-in. I actually made a note about it once, she added, almost apologetically now, as if she understood she'd just detonated something in the middle of a waiting room. The consistency of the payments, no missed months, ever, even around the holidays. I remember thinking, whoever this is, they clearly care about getting this right. Rosa didn't say anything for a long moment. She just stared at me the way you might stare at a photograph you'd looked at 100 times and were only now, for the first time, actually seeing clearly. Rosa's face did something I hadn't seen from her in 6 years of knowing her. Genuine, unguarded shock, quickly followed by something that looked, unmistakably, like shame. I didn't know, she said quietly, almost to herself. I thought Vincent had been covering it this whole time. I never once thought to actually ask. I didn't want you to know, I said, keeping my voice calm and even, not performing hurt, not reaching for vindication, simply stating a fact that had been true for 2 years. I wasn't doing it to be thanked. I was doing it because Anthony was scared for you, and I didn't want you carrying the extra weight of worrying about money on top of everything else you were already dealing with. Rosa sat down heavily in one of the waiting room chairs, visibly working through something internally before she managed to speak again. I told you that you'd never belong in this family, she said slowly, and you were quietly keeping me alive the entire time I was saying it. I don't think either of those two things has to cancel the other one out perfectly, I told her. But I'd like it if we could start being honest with each other from here on, instead of just polite. Dr. Yuan, sensing the weight settling over the room, quietly gave the two of us an extra private minute before calling Rosa back for her appointment. I sat alone in that waiting room afterward for a long while, feeling less triumphant than simply, quietly relieved that the truth had finally arrived on its own timeline, in its own strange and unplanned way, rather than one I'd had to force into existence myself. Rosa and I have spent the 4 months since slowly rebuilding something more honest than what we had before. It isn't perfect. There are still awkward silences, still moments where 6 years of history sit heavy in a room. But it's real in a way our relationship simply hadn't been before that afternoon in the waiting room. She stopped making comments about blood and belonging entirely. Anthony tells me his mother has, on more than one occasion since, actually corrected other relatives who've made careless comments about outsiders in the family, a small shift, but a real one, and not one I take for granted given where we started. One Sunday about a month after the waiting room, Rosa called and asked, somewhat stiffly, if I'd want to come over early before everyone else arrived, just the two of us, to help her go through some old recipe cards she wanted to pass down. It was such a small, ordinary invitation, and I remember sitting in my car outside her house for a moment before going in, genuinely unsure what to expect. We ended up spending 2 hours at her kitchen table, and at one point, without any real preamble, she told me about her own mother-in-law decades ago. A woman who'd apparently made Rosa feel exactly the way she'd made me feel, and how she'd promised herself back then she'd never do the same thing to someone else. I broke that promise to myself with you, she said, not quite looking at me. I'm not entirely sure why. I think it's easier to pass on what was done to you than to actually stop it. I didn't have a clean answer for that. I just told her I appreciated her saying it out loud, and we kept sorting through the recipe cards. 2 weeks ago, Rosa asked me, almost shyly, if I'd help her understand her latest round of billing statements, since she said she trusted my read on them more than anyone else's in the family. It was such a small request. It also would have been unthinkable 18 months earlier, and we both seemed to understand that without either of us saying it out loud. Here's what I actually took away from all of it. Sitting in that waiting room and watching one doctor's simple, offhand recognition quietly undo 6 years of a story I'd been told about my own place in this family. Belonging was never actually hers to grant or withhold in the first place. People can tell you that you don't belong as many times as they like, in front of as many relatives as they want. They can't argue with 2 years of consistent, unglamorous care that was never about earning anyone's approval to begin with. If any part of this hit close to home, tell me in the comments about a quiet way you've shown love to someone who didn't always make it easy to. Subscribe if you want to keep seeing how these stories unfold. Share this with someone who's ever been told they don't belong somewhere they've been faithfully showing up for anyway. And I'll see you in the next one.